Hey there folks, and welcome to the second video for Chapter 31, Plant Structure, Growth, and Reproduction. So in the last video, we talked a bit about some of the basic layers of structure in typical plant bodies. Now we're going to look a little bit closer. When we are looking at living things, especially when they are growing, we observe two different types of growth. Either the living thing typically does all of its growing at one time, more or less, and then it stops. This is called determinate growth, and animals do this. Animals don't keep growing throughout their lives. They grow until they're adults and they're mature and then they stop. Most plants, however, do something called indeterminate growth. They will continue to grow throughout their lives. They may not always grow as quickly, but they'll keep growing gradually throughout their lives. Different plants also have life cycles that take a different amount of time. Annual plants will sprout from a seed, grow up, become mature, reproduce, set seed, and die all in 1 year. Those are annuals. Biennials take a couple of years, but perennials will live for many years, somewhere between 4 years, some for thousands of years. We'll get into that at the end of the video. The area where this growth takes place is a very specific region of the root or stem. Both will grow just in different directions. The area, the correct tissue that actually does the growing, where new cells are made, is called the meristem. The apical meristem is where you'll find the meristem in buds, around young leaves, and at the top of the plant. But you'll also find the root apical meristem down at the very bottom of the root, protected by something called the root cap. And this is where the actual site of growth is. It's where brand new cells are made. And this is where the kind of growth called primary growth takes place. These are the rounds of cell division in the root and shoot apical meristems that actually enable a plant to lengthen, especially when it's very young. That's not the only kind of growth, however, that plants undergo. Secondary growth is all about getting bigger, not just taller, but wider, broader. So as you see up here in the very young part of the plant, at that apical meristem where all the fresh growth is occurring, the plant is fairly narrow and green and tender and young. But as you go down the trunk of the tree, it gets broader and wider. This is due to secondary growth. Along with secondary growth, we get the vascular cambrium and the lateral meristems developing. Whereas the apical meristem lets the plant get longer, or the roots delve deeper, the lateral meristems allow the plant to get wider, thicker. The vascular cambrium is a cylinder of meristem cells that can also grow between the primary xylem and phloem that were present when the plant first started to grow, and it's still up here in the apical area. However, a bigger, thicker plant needs more xylem and phloem to keep the plant supplied with water and nutrients, and it does. The new bundles of xylem and phloem are called secondary xylem and phloem because they develop during secondary growth. Hey, makes sense. It's awesome. Secondary xylem actually makes up a lot of the wood of a tree or shrub or vine. And over the years as they go by, the woody stem gets thicker and thicker as the vascular cambrium that lets it get wider produces more and more layers of secondary xylem. Eventually, when you get enough layers, the epidermis around that layer is shed and it's replaced with a new outer layer called cork, which is what we see in one of the outermost layers of trees. The cork cells are basically dead, very waxy, thick cells. And they help hold in water, but they also help protect all of the layers of living cells underneath inside the wood. Cork cells are made by cork cambrium, which is again another kind of meristem cell. Underneath the cork cambrium you find secondary phloem, and lots and lots and lots of layers of secondary xylem and phloem, which you may call the annual rings of a tree, but in your textbook you'll see them called wood rays. It's the exact same thing. Everything outside the cork, those dead layers outside the cork, is what we call the bark. It's everything outside the external vascular cambrium, and it's mostly made out of secondary phloem, cork cambrium and cork cells, and again, it's very tough, very strong, made out of dead cells, and it's there to protect all of the younger functioning cells underneath. The wood rays that you'll see consist of parenchyma cells that move water and nutrients and store things in the plant, and also help the plant heal. So they'll carry things to a wounded area of the plant to help it heal. In the very, very center, in the hardwood, also called the heartwood, is the oldest layer of secondary xylem. And these cells are so old, they don't even really function anymore. They no longer transport water. They don't really do anything. And this is why you may see a very old tree that may actually be hollow all the way through the center, but it still survives because all of the functioning cells in the softwood, what your textbook calls the sapwood, they still function, and they're still doing the jobs of carrying water and nutrients throughout the tree. They're the ones that matter. When an angiosperm is reproducing, we're still practicing alternation of generations, just like we did in moss and ferns and other much older types, much simpler types of plants. We start, however, here in the flower. The flower is the major reproductive structure, the reproductive organ of the angiosperm. You have male and female parts of this flower. Male parts of the flower are those that are associated with making pollen, because inside a pollen grain is a sperm. Pollen is made inside an anther, which is held up to where pollinators can get it by a very thin stem called a filament. Together, these are called a stamen. Inside the ovary, at the center of the flower, there are ovules. Those are the plant eggs. And there's a pathway for the sperm inside the pollen to take if it gets there. The pollen, will land on the stigma and will digest its way down this tube called the style until it eventually gets to the ovary. The stigma, style, and ovary together are called the pistil. And underneath the ovary at the base of the flower is the receptacle, where the ovary attaches to the base of the flower. The leaf-like structures that protect the flower before it's ready to bloom, those are called sepals. The flower is surrounded by petals that help attract the attention of pollinators. And the stem of the flower that helps hold it where pollinators can get to it is called a pedicel. When pollen actually lands in the right place on the stigma, at this point, in alternation of generations, you have the haploid gamete, the pollen, the sperm and the pollen, landing on the diploid sporophyte. Right? The plant is diploid, and the flower is diploid, and the stigma that's part of the flower is diploid, but the sperm inside the pollen is haploid. All right? So the plant is the sporophyte. The parts of the flower that actually make the pollen and make the eggs are the gametophytes. All right, so this is the whole flower, taken as one structure, is the gametophyte on the sporophyte of the adult plant, going back to that alternation of generations type vocabulary. When pollen lands on the style, it digests its way down the style from the stigma and up, down and around and up into the ovary. Now, pollen are kind of interesting in that when they deliver their information, their sperm, it's not just the one sperm cell. It's the sperm cell and something called the generative cell. And what arrives are these two cells, one of which is going to fertilize this egg, which you see here in orange. The other one, however, dodges around the egg and fertilizes this this bundle of cells right here in the center. It doesn't really fertilize with it, that's the wrong term, but it's going to fuse with it, and the DNA in the nucleus of this other sperm cell is going to fuse with the nuclei of that bundle in the center of the ovule. That bundle is called the polar nuclei. Labels over here. What results is a triploid 3N bundle of cells. This is an event called double fertilization. One sperm for the actual egg, the other sperm for the polar nuclei. And this is important because eventually that triploid, the 3N nucleus, is going to grow into something called the endosperm. And that is the food storing tissue for that embryo plant later on in time, inside the seed. Once fertilization is complete and you have an embryonic plant, the ovary, the egg, develops into a seed. A seed has many specific layers that are going to become particular things in the adult plant. But among those things are the embryo plant, here in a eudicot, and here in a monocot, and is surrounded and protected by a hard seed coat that keeps it from being damaged until it germinates. Here's the endosperm, by the way, that results from double fertilization. That's that source of food for the embryo. Alright? What happens to the rest of the ovary? Well, that's what becomes the fruit that you know and are oh so familiar with. See, here is the fruit of this pea plant, and here are the seeds. You can even see where the fruit developed from the flower up here. This is for peas, a type of simple fruit. Here's a raspberry, and down here you can see where all the dried stamens are left over from before the fruit developed from the flower. See, here are the stamens while they're functioning. Down here, underneath the stigma and the style, down under there is the ovary. Well, after the fruit develops, here are the stigmas, and here are the mature ovaries that have become the raspberry. Here's a pineapple, the really odd one. Whole inflorescence, a whole bunch of separate flowers that together form the pineapple fruit. And here's a classic apple. See, here's the pedicel that supported the flower. Here's the stem it becomes when the apple is ripe. Here are the sepals. And here they are, along with the remains of the stamen and style. See, here are the stamens, here's the style, from when the flower was reproducing. But here's what we have once those ovaries develop into fruit. See, there are the ovules that have become seeds, and there's the rest of the ovary tissue that has become the fruit we recognize as an apple. Weird stuff, huh? Awesome. When eventually those seeds get into the ground, eventually they will germinate, which means first they need to split the seed coat. Remember, that's a hard, tough, durable seed coat. It's there to protect the plant inside. So first the seed coat has to split or break open. And the first thing that the embryonic plant does is it starts a hypocotyl or radical, depending on whether or not we're discussing a eudicot or a monocot. But in either way, that's going to become the brand new root system. And once that's deep enough in the ground to support the plant and get it water and nutrients, eventually it's going to sprout its cotyledons, 2 in the eudicot, 1 in the monocot, and those will eventually mature into a plant that can grow actual leaves that have proper vascular tissues and can undergo photosynthesis. Some plants can also reproduce asexually by making clones out of themselves. This is what this creosote plant here is doing. This is in our local Mojave Desert. Creosote is the big plant out there, and it's one of the most common ones. And the vast majority of them are all genetic clones. They will run stems out and roots out underneath the soil, and new plants with the exact same DNA will pop out a little ways away. They form rings like this. Spider plants do the exact same thing, but above ground. Some will also reproduce through something called fragmentation, like this moss, where just a little piece breaks off, falls off the parent plant, falls a little distance away, and establishes itself there. That's what those bits of moss are doing. Some of these reproductive cycles take a year or two, but some plants can live a fantastically long time. We're talking thousands of years, from the oldest tree in the world, the bristlecone pine, that can live well over 5,000 years, down to our own proud Californian giant sequoia, right here, that will live well over 3,000 years. And these plants will continue to grow, again, indeterminate growth, and they'll continue to reproduce throughout these incredibly long lifetimes. Not necessarily every year. Sometimes the reproductive cycle gets very slow, particularly in the case of the bristlecone. But they're still trucking, as long as nothing gets in their way. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap it up for Chapter 31. Go check out some of these really long-lived plants. Boy, they will humble you. They make you feel real young and small. But it's wonderful. And I will see you next time. Bye, folks.